It's a book. The Bible. Fantastic. The cause of many wars, and probably will be the cause of more. And by me talking about it, probably there's somebody sitting there saying, "I kill you!" Or maybe with a Texan accent. I've read it. And I am constantly surprised how many religious people who try to push their belief in this book upon me are unable to answer basic questions that I throw at them. Even from the very beginning. Now, the classic I've probably talked about before, I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this before, the story of Adam and Eve. There are two versions in the same book. Page 1, everyone forgets, which says that God created man and woman together, therefore man and woman are equal. Or the commonly accepted version, ladies, take note, that man was created first, Adam, then he walked around for 300 or something odd years, spreading his seed on the floor, whatever that means, and then God looked down and said, "Give us a rib, or you go blind," and he made him Eve, therefore suggesting that man is superior to woman. Think about it. So already there's social manipulation in the interpretation of the choice of that book, which to some extent has a bit of cherry picking if you wish to do it. But that's your choice if you want to base your rights on that. Now, my understanding of the Bible is that it is a collection of stories that have been put together, that were put together about the time of Jesus, in fact, not before. It was not written before the time as we refer to as the Christian era, let's say. These stories put together in the book, okay, seem to have come from different sources. Therefore there is a theory, quite widely and logical theory. This would explain the first 2 pages, for example, of the Bible, which have 2 different versions of the same story. And later you will also find that there is a second version of the flood story, and continue. The Bible is a collection of tribal stories. Now, what are tribal stories? Tribal stories are events that have been remembered and been passed down from generation to generation, etc., etc., etc. The Hebrews will be the first to admit it was oral transfer of their biblical stories, of course. How many generations? Now, interesting concept of the thought of the age of the world, especially in the USA. You have some people who believe that the world's about 6,000 years old. Some people, the other creationists, will go back to 10,000 years. But this refers more to the creation of those particular societies which base their tribal story and therefore their book and their belief upon. Okay, for them, the world didn't exist before their group existed, or the memory of their group. And that's a collective memory, the collective memory of their fairy tale. Their fairy tale is the story of their existence. Okay. Earlier stories most likely existed and they've been lost over time, as many stories are lost over time. Okay. Depending on the desire, the popularity, and the wish of the people to remember that story or have that story remembered by the people. An important point. You'll also notice that if you go into looking at various versions of the Bible, the King James is not the same as others. Before that, the King James was a revised version, generally revised for political scopes. Anyway, at the moment I just want to concentrate on one particular story of the Bible. Let's go the beginning, but not the beginning of the world, the 7 days prior to the creation of man, or even the creation of man, which is very short. Doesn't tell you a lot really, so I mean it's not very detailed. So how you can say you have the answer to everything in such a short passage? It is obvious that that particular creation story, as most creation stories, if you look around the world outside the area of the followers of the book, Islam, the Hebrews, or the Jews, if you go into their history, the Hebrew history, you'll find that they're not all it's a little bit more complicated than most people want to be known or will admit, but I'll leave that for the moment. Or the Christians. We have one concept of the beginning. Okay. The Chinese and other nations, the Australians, the Aboriginals have their story, and there's some very interesting stories. The Hindu story is nice. Big serpent floating around in the void. Okay, lotuses and all sorts of things. Anyway, let's skip that. Let's go to the story of the Garden of Eden and the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, or good and bad, or right and wrong. Now, as stories are tales, tales are stories, fairy tales are stories, one must remember that fairy tales once had a meaning. Here's something interesting for you. The story of Cinderella and her glass slipper. That's the French version, the glass slipper, but it's much older. The French didn't have that story. Originally it's a German story, and if you look into it you'll find out that the slipper wasn't glass, it was actually fur or pelt, and it was a tribal practice of the woman creating a slipper and giving it to the man she wanted to marry. We elaborated it, we detached it from its roots, and it became fantasy. And that's the problem. The Bible has been detached from any reality and become fantasy, and that's where the confusion comes in. You want to look into history and see where we came from, then look for reality. Don't get lost in fantasy. This is my thoughts on the possible meaning of the story of the Garden of Eden and the apple. Looking at the history of humanity and looking at various forms of humanity, taking into great consideration the period of time of the hunter-gatherers and present-day hunter-gatherers that still exist. I've talked before about the people of the Kalahari Desert as a great example. Look up the sand people of the Kalahari Desert to get some reference here, okay, and see how they live. Okay, they don't have the day off on Sunday, so they're not very religious. They do a 7-day week, but it's not really work. They just wake up in the morning, go out and get what they need in one of the most hostile environments. Okay, there isn't a lot there. There's no Tesco's down the road, no Walmart.